Hustle culture was never a wealth strategy, it was a product. And the first generation that grew up watching it run to completion quietly decided they weren't buying it. Here is exactly why, how, and what they're doing instead. Imagine a guy, he wakes up every day at 4:30 in the morning, cold shower, he reads a book on sales psychology, he goes to his full-time job, he comes home, opens his laptop, works on his side hustle for 4 more hours, eats dinner standing up because sitting feels like quitting somehow. He posts on LinkedIn every single day. His posts are about grinding, about sacrifice, about the 1%. He has a note on his mirror that says, "Outwork everyone." He tells himself the results are compounding, just invisibly, just beneath the surface. He does this for 2 years straight. At the end of those 2 years, he has a solid LinkedIn presence, maybe 8,000 followers, a podcast that gets 600 downloads per episode, and he has made around $19,000 from various side projects, before taxes. Before the self-employment tax that freelancers pay on top of income tax, which pushed his effective rate close to 38%. So let's call it roughly $12,000 in take-home earnings in 2 years, from a schedule that most people in a labor law documentary would find alarming. Meanwhile, his friend, equally smart, same starting salary, same city, same general circumstances, did almost nothing. He maxed out his 401k, he bought a cheap index fund every month like it was a utility bill. He read maybe 3 finance books total across those 2 years, which is about 1.5 books per year. And he spent most of his evenings playing video games or watching television without a single gram of guilt. Same 2 years. That friend added roughly $42,000 to his net worth. On paper. Automatically, without posting a single thing about discipline. And the guy posting about the 4:30 grind would look at that number and say, yeah, but I'm building something. I'm building long-term value. You'll see it eventually. And maybe he is. Maybe. But here is the question I want you to actually sit with before we go any further. If effort were genuinely the variable that determined financial outcomes, why are the people posting the most about effort, statistically, the ones with the least money to show for it? We're going to explain exactly how hustle culture works as a system, where the value actually flows inside of it, why Gen Z's rejection of it is one of the most financially rational moves a generation has made in decades, and what the people who figured it out early are building instead. No inspiration, no motivation, just the mechanics of how the thing actually works and why it's getting weird. The metaphor I'm going to use throughout this entire video is a treadmill. Not a broken treadmill, not a defective, cheap, shaking at high speed treadmill, a perfectly functioning, high quality treadmill. The machine works exactly as advertised. You step on, you run, you burn calories, you sweat, your heart rate goes up. You feel viscerally like you are accomplishing something real and meaningful. The machine is doing its job without any malfunction whatsoever. The problem was never the machine. The problem is that a treadmill, by definition, does not take you anywhere. It is movement without displacement. It is effort without position change. That is hustle culture. Not a scam in the crude sense. Not a conspiracy. The system is working perfectly. It's just working for someone else. And the people who got rich off hustle culture were not overwhelmingly, statistically, structurally, the people running on the treadmill. They were the people who built the treadmill, sold the content about running on the treadmill, sold the course on how to run faster on the treadmill, and charged premium prices for a front row spot in the treadmill room. We're going to come back to this treadmill throughout the video, keep it running in your head. Let's go back to where hustle culture actually came from, because the origin matters more than most people realize, and the origin is almost never discussed honestly. Hustle culture as we know it, the 4 a.m. club aesthetic, the Gary Vee era, the grind don't stop personal branding machine, exploded somewhere between 2012 and 2017. And the timing was not random. It erupted right after the financial crisis of 2008, right when social media platforms were scaling their content ecosystems aggressively and needed an enormous volume of free user-generated content to feed their algorithms. And right when an entire generation of millennials was entering a labor market that had quietly, structurally, without any formal announcement, changed the deal on them. Here is what was happening in the economic background that the hustle content never ever addressed honestly. Between 1973 and 2020, worker productivity in the United States increased by roughly 240%. Real wages for the median worker increased by approximately 15% across the same period. Read that again slowly. The economic output of the average worker more than tripled. The compensation for that output barely moved. The economy got dramatically larger. The workers who powered it received an almost insulting fraction of that growth. And this wasn't accidental. This was the structural result of specific policy choices. The weakening of collective bargaining, the shift from defined benefit pensions to 401k plans, the globalization of labor markets that allowed companies to arbitrage wages internationally, the rise of shareholder primacy as a corporate ideology. These were real, documented, deliberate decisions made by people with the power to make them. And they produced a labor market where working harder in and of itself was a dramatically worse deal than it had been for any previous generation in the post-war era. So you had a generation entering the workforce after 2008, mortgage markets collapsed, job security was functionally gone, pension plans were already a historical artifact, wages were stagnant relative to productivity and relative to cost of living. And the cultural response to this genuinely broken structural situation was work harder, wake up earlier, build a personal brand, post content, take the course. Hustle your way out. Now, I want you to think about this like a system. Set aside any emotional reaction to it and just trace the incentive flows. If you tell millions of financially anxious young people that their survival, their dignity, their future financial security all depend on working more hours, building personal brands, buying productivity courses, and attending entrepreneurship conferences, who specifically captures the value generated by that behavior? The social media platforms capture attention and advertising revenue. Every hour someone spends consuming hustle content or producing it is an hour feeding platform growth metrics. The course creators capture tuition at whatever price point the market will bear, from $47 all the way to $20,000. Selling information about building businesses to people who, in many cases, have not yet built businesses. The book publishers capture royalties. The conference organizers capture ticket sales at $800 to $3,000 per seat. The coaching program operators capture monthly retainer fees. The productivity app developers capture subscriptions. The person on the treadmill, they are generating value for everyone in that ecosystem simultaneously, and in many cases they are paying directly for the privilege of doing so. I want to be extremely clear. This is not a conspiracy. Nobody sat in a room in 2010 and said, here is a coordinated plan to extract value from ambitious young people while keeping them broke. Markets don't work like that. The incentive structure, simply, organically, inevitably, mechanically, rewarded the people selling hustle over the people doing it. That is how incentive structures work. Follow the incentive to the end of the chain and you find the beneficiary. The beneficiaries of hustle culture were not on balance the people hustling. And there is a meta-irony buried in here that I genuinely enjoy, analytically. The people who got richest off hustle culture often did it by building leverage-based businesses, content platforms, course funnels, distribution networks, and then teaching other people to achieve wealth through direct labor and personal output. The medium was leverage, the message was grind. The whole thing was structurally incoherent if you looked at it from a systems perspective, which almost nobody did at the time. Now let me do some math. Concrete, unglamorous math, because math is the only honest thing in this conversation. The pitch of hustle culture, stripped completely of its aesthetic and its branding, is essentially this. Trade your time for money at a higher hourly rate than your current job pays, by building skills and putting in extra hours. Work more. Earn more per hour. Scale income through volume of effort applied. That's the model. That's all of it. Here is the fundamental problem with that model as a wealth-building strategy, and I want you to understand this at the structural level rather than just hearing it as a talking point. Time is capped. You have 16 to 18 usable waking hours per day. That number does not change based on your ambition, your discipline, your morning routine, or how many podcast episodes you've consumed about high performance. Even if you manage to monetize every single one of those hours, which nobody can sustain without serious physical and psychological deterioration, you have hit a ceiling, not a wealth ceiling, a comfort ceiling. You can get comfortable, you can get to six figures. You cannot get to the kind of financial freedom that fundamentally changes your options in life by trading time alone. The math does not permit it. Let me show you this concretely. Person A hustles genuinely hard. They're skilled, they're disciplined, they work their full-time job, let's say $60,000 a year, and they build a freelance consulting business on the side. Through real effort and real skill, they build that side income to $40,000 per year after 2 years of serious work. They're earning $100,000 gross annually. That's impressive. That genuinely puts them in roughly the top 20% of earners in the United States. Person B earns the same $60,000 salary, same city, same starting point. But instead of building a side hustle, they live on $44,000 a year. Modest but not miserable. They invest $16,000 annually, spread across a maxed 401k with employer match plus a Roth IRA, into a diversified total market index fund, returning an average of 9% annualized. They don't think about it much. They mostly read, sleep well, and maintain their relationships. After 10 years, count everything. Person A may have made close to $1 million in gross total income if they maintain the hustle. But now count the self-employment tax, roughly 15.3% on top of income tax, putting their effective tax rate closer to 38 to 40% on that freelance income. Count the hours, roughly 2,000 extra hours per year at minimum. 20,000 extra hours over 10 years, that's 2.5 full additional years of working hours extracted from person A's life. Person B's invested capital after 10 years at 9% average annual returns has grown to approximately $250,000. They worked 0 extra hours, posted nothing, sacrificed nothing really. Just spent slightly less than they earned and automated the difference. And now here is where the math breaks permanently in favor of person B, and I mean permanently. $250,000 at 9% generates roughly $22,500 per year, automatically without any additional labor input from person B. They have crossed a structural threshold where their money is producing income independent of their time. Person A, if they stop the freelance work tomorrow, generates exactly 0 from it, because they are the machine, they are the treadmill. The moment they step off, the belt stops. There is no residual, there is no compounding, there is no passive generation. There is just the work, and then the absence of work, and the income follows accordingly. This is the fundamental asymmetry that hustle culture almost never addresses, honestly. Effort-based income scales with you and stops with you. Asset-based income scales without you and continues without you. The entire goal of a serious financial architecture is to convert your effort-based income into assets at the highest possible rate and as early as possible, so that your money begins doing work that you no longer have to do. The compounding threshold, the moment your assets generate enough return to meaningfully cover expenses, is the actual financial event worth working toward. Not the hustle, not the grind, not the personal brand. The threshold. You think the core problem with hustle culture is that it makes you exhausted, but actually the core problem is that it makes you structurally dependent. Dependent on your own energy, dependent on your own continuous presence, dependent on your own time, which is the one resource in your life with a hard, non-negotiable biological ceiling. Hustle culture made effort feel like capital. It isn't. Effort is input. Capital is the thing that produces output without you. There's a version of hustle culture that does work, and I want to be precise about this rather than just dismissing the whole thing. If you use a period of intense effort, say 2 or 3 years, defined, finite, specifically to accumulate capital that you then deploy into assets or leverage-based systems, you have used the treadmill correctly and strategically. You stepped on, you generated energy, you captured that energy in a battery. You stepped off. The problem is that hustle culture never told you to step off. The message was perpetual. Run harder, run longer. Sleep less. The destination is right around the corner. There is no corner on a treadmill. There is only the belt, always moving, taking you nowhere. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, where I actually run the numbers and trace the incentive structure behind things that everyone else is just shouting about, it makes logical sense to subscribe. I put out this type of analysis consistently, and I'd rather it be in your feed than not. Now we get to why Gen Z specifically is the generation that looked at all of this and said, collectively, without formal coordination, no. And I want to make a careful argument here, because most of the commentary on this topic, from older journalists, from corporate executives complaining about work ethic, from HR departments writing concerned blog posts, is missing the actual mechanism. Gen Z did not grow up reading about hustle culture in theory. They grew up watching its results in real time, with receipts, at scale, and high definition. Think about the information environment of someone born in 2002 or 2003. By the time they were 16 or 17 years old, they could watch a millennial content creator or influencer in complete longitudinal detail. The grind content in year 1, the brand deals in year 2, the slightly bigger apartment in year 3, and then in year 4, the quiet disappearance. The algorithm changed, the platform deprioritized the format. The audience moved on to the next thing. The income structure, which was entirely dependent on platform-controlled distribution and audience attention, collapsed in a single quarter. Gone. No assets, no compounding capital. No structural residual. Just gone. Gen Z watched that happen not once, dozens of times, hundreds of times across their feeds. They watched the full arc, not the highlight reel that hustle culture traditionally marketed. The actual arc. Start, grind, brief success, structural vulnerability revealed, collapse. They saw what happens when your entire income is tethered to a platform that does not care about you, to an audience's finite attention, to a content format that has a cultural shelf life measured in months. They also saw something closer to home. They watched their older siblings and cousins, the early millennial adopters of the hustle gospel, spend 5 to 7 years building personal brands, working 60-hour weeks, sacrificing relationships, skipping health maintenance, delaying any semblance of financial stability, and end up with a modest income at best, negligible savings, and a fragile identity constructed almost entirely out of metrics that a platform could change in an afternoon. The engagement rate dropped, the follower growth stalled, and suddenly, the whole psychological edifice, the I'm building something narrative that sustained them through years of exhaustion, started cracking. Here is a data point I find genuinely striking. Roughly 42% of Gen Z workers in surveys from the early 2020s reported that they would not describe themselves as hard workers in the traditional cultural sense. Not because they are objectively lazy or unwilling to do difficult things, but because they explicitly and deliberately reject the cultural framing of work as a core identity. That's a vocabulary shift, not a motivation problem. They're not saying they refuse to do hard things. They're saying they refuse to let their sense of self be contingent on labor output because they watched what that does to a person over time. The burnout. The emptiness when the metrics drop. The way people who built their identity around their hustle completely unravel when the hustle stops producing. This is pattern recognition operating at a generational scale. When a cohort watches a cultural experiment run to completion, when they see the real output, not the marketing version of it, and then declines to repeat the experiment, that is not apathy. That is rational Bayesian updating. They observed the data, they updated their priors, they changed their behavior accordingly. Let me use the video game analogy because I find it genuinely clarifying and because I spent a significant portion of my adolescence in front of a screen with a controller in my hands. Imagine you're watching someone play a game on hard mode, and they're dying. Constantly, they restart, they grind, they get a little further, they die again. After 40 hours of watching them play, they've completed maybe 30% of the game. Then someone hands you the same game and says, "Your turn." Are you going to immediately set it to hard mode? Or are you going to spend 20 minutes understanding the game's mechanics, finding out if there's a more efficient path, checking whether the difficulty setting actually changes the quality of the experience in any meaningful way? Hustle culture is hard mode with no save points and a camera pointed at you the entire time to make sure you look like you're suffering appropriately. Gen Z looked at the footage and said, there has to be a better setting. And the response from the generation that spent years on hard mode was, if you're not playing on hard mode, you're not a real player, which is not an argument. That is just gatekeeping dressed up as wisdom. To be fair, and I think this matters, part of what reads as hustle culture rejection is just normal generational recalibration. Every generation pushes back against the dominant values of the one before it. Baby boomers rejected post-war corporate conformity. Generation X rejected boomer loyalty to institutions that had no loyalty in return. Millennials rejected the guarantee of stability that a degree was supposed to provide. Gen Z is rejecting the idea that effort in isolation is a moral virtue deserving of financial reward. But here's what's genuinely different this time. The rejection is more financially literate than any previous version. It is not simply countercultural. It's analytically grounded. It's not, I don't want to work. It is, in substance, I don't want to operate in a structure that has been empirically demonstrated to produce effort without commensurate return. And I would like to understand what structures actually do produce return before I commit my time to them. That is a completely different conversation. And the people who hear that and respond with they're just lazy are, I suspect, mostly people who have a vested financial or psychological interest in keeping the treadmill populated, because their business model depends on it. By the way, if you have ever watched a hustle culture motivational talk, and I have watched several, not a period of my life I'm particularly proud of, there is always a moment where the speaker describes their morning routine in the most elaborate, exhausting possible detail, like they are reciting the articles of a very strict religious order. Wake up at 4, cold plunge for 6 minutes, meditate for 20, journal, read 30 pages, run 5 kilometers, all of this before 6 a.m. And you're sitting there with a calculator. If you wake up at 4 a.m. and you sleep 8 hours, which they also insist is non-negotiable for peak performance, you went to bed at 8 p.m. You went to bed at the same time as an 8-year-old, which honestly is a legitimate life choice. But let's stop describing it as a secret weapon that the masses are too undisciplined to access. So Gen Z rejected the treadmill. Fine. But rejection without replacement is just cynicism. And cynicism as a financial strategy has a historical return rate of exactly 0. The more interesting question, the question that actually matters for anyone watching this who is trying to build real wealth rather than just feel validated about not buying into hustle culture, is what replaced it? And the answer is more specific and more interesting than most of the reporting on this topic suggests. It is not that Gen Z is less ambitious. The ambition is still there. But the ambition has migrated structurally, meaningfully, away from effort-based frameworks and toward leverage-based frameworks. And that migration is one of the most important financial developments happening in the economy right now. And it's happening largely without being named or recognized for what it is. Let me define leverage carefully because the word is used imprecisely in most financial content. Leverage, in this context, does not mean debt necessarily. It means getting an output that is disproportionate to the direct effort you put in. That's it. That's the whole concept. A lever mechanically lets you lift a weight that would be impossible to lift with direct force alone. Financial leverage means your output exceeds your direct input by some meaningful multiplier. It means you are not in a one-to-one relationship between hours worked and value created. There are 3 categories of leverage available to an individual in 2026. The first is capital leverage, which means money working on your behalf, generating returns without requiring your direct labor. The second is distribution leverage, which means your ideas or your product reaching people you have never met and never interacted with, at any hour of the day, at essentially 0 marginal cost per additional person reached. The third is systems or code leverage, which means a process, a tool, or a product that you build once and that delivers value repeatedly, automatically, without you rebuilding it every time. Hustle culture as a model operates in almost none of these categories. It operates in labor, unmediated, direct, one-to-one labor, 1 hour of effort in, 1 hour's worth of output out. There is no multiplier, there is no residual. There is no compounding. You are running on the treadmill, and the belt speed is the only variable determining your output. The only way to increase output is to run faster, which has a physiological limit, or to run for more hours, which has a temporal limit. The shift I'm observing in my peer group, and I'm 26, so I'm sitting directly on the generational fault line where I can watch this happening in real time among people I actually know, is a very practical, very unromantic move toward ownership thinking. And the way it expresses itself is not through grand entrepreneurial announcements or I quit my job to follow my dreams videos. It's quieter and more structural than that. It looks like I will live moderately below my means for 2 to 3 defined years, accumulate capital, and deploy that capital into assets, index funds, a rental property, anything that generates a return independent of my presence. Simultaneously, I will build something with distribution leverage, maybe a YouTube channel, maybe a newsletter, maybe a digital product or a small software tool, or an automated e-commerce system. Something that, once built, reaches people without me being present for each interaction. The timeline on this approach is longer than the hustle culture pitch. You don't get the dopamine hit of posting about your grind. You don't get the social validation of having a visible hustle. but the asymmetry is structurally superior. The effort is front-loaded and finite, the return is back-loaded and compounding, and the systems you build continue generating value after the intense input phase is over. Let me show you what this actually looks like through a specific realistic scenario. Let's call this person Marcus, 24 years old, working in tech as a junior developer, making $78,000 a year. Average city, nothing exceptional about his situation. No family money, no viral moment. No unfair advantages worth noting. Marcus is not hustling in the cultural sense. He is not waking up at 4 a.m. He is not posting about discipline. He is not buying courses. But he is doing several things with unusual deliberateness. First, he is living on $52,000 a year. Not miserable, he has a decent apartment, he eats well, he goes out with friends occasionally, but deliberately, consciously below his means. That generates roughly $26,000 annually that doesn't get spent. He maxes his 401k. The contribution limit in 2026 sits at $23,500 and receives a full employer match that adds approximately $4,000 on top of that. So he's directing close to $28,000 a year into tax-advantaged compound growth automatically every paycheck without having to think about it or make a decision about it each month. The automation matters because it removes decision fatigue from the equation. At 9% average annualized returns, which is roughly the historical average for a diversified total market index fund, $28,000 contributed annually for 25 years grows to approximately $2,800,000 without any additional effort, without any side hustle, without any content creation, without a single sunrise ritual, just the mechanical, boring, deeply uninstagrammable process of living below his means and automating the difference into compounding assets. But Marcus is also doing one more thing, because he's 24 and wants more than just a retirement account. On evenings and weekends, not a punishing schedule, maybe 12 to 15 hours a week total, he's building a small software tool targeting a niche he understands deeply from his day job. Not a startup with venture capital ambitions, not a product that needs to compete with enterprise software. A focused, specific tool that solves a specific, genuine problem for a specific kind of small business. He's not rushing it, he's not grinding it, he's building it carefully with attention over roughly 8 months. He launches it at $49 per month per user. If Marcus gets to 100 paying users, which for a well-positioned niche product solving a real problem is an achievable number, that is $4,900 per month in recurring revenue. $58,800 per year from a product he built in his spare time over 8 months that now runs largely on its own with some customer support and occasional updates. At that point, Marcus's effective annual income is approximately $136,800. He is 25 years old. He has never posted about hustle. He has not built a personal brand. He has not sacrificed his health or his relationships. He has not bought a single course about entrepreneurship. And here is the critical structural point. That software revenue is not attached to his hours. If Marcus takes a month off to travel, the tool keeps running, the subscriptions keep charging, the revenue keeps arriving. He is no longer the machine. He is the person who built the machine. That distinction between being the machine and owning the machine is the most important financial distinction in the modern economy. It is the difference between income and wealth, between the treadmill and the gym. If Marcus gets to 300 paying users, not a fantasy number for a solid niche product with real utility, that's $14,700 per month, $176,400 per year, recurring. At 25, while his 401k is still compounding automatically in the background, while he is by every observable external metric a relatively normal person who is not posting about his grind, Marcus didn't run faster on the treadmill. Marcus studied the treadmill, understood its mechanical limitations, got off of it, and built something that generates energy without requiring his continuous presence on the belt. There's a version of this conversation I've watched play out on LinkedIn more times than I can count. Someone with a senior title posts something like, Gen Z doesn't want to work. I offered a 22-year-old $80,000 a year and they asked for remote work and a 4-day week. This generation is soft. 4,000 likes, hundreds of comments agreeing. Meanwhile, the specific 22-year-old who asked those questions likely did so because working from home saves them 12 hours a week in commute time and $200 a month in transportation costs. and the 4-day week gives them one more full day to build the system they're actually trying to build. That person will have more assets at 30 than the person posting. They will have built something that generates income independent of their physical presence at a desk. They will never in their entire career use the phrase, "That's just not how we do things here." Soft? That person is running a different optimization function. You're frustrated that they won't optimize for yours. So, back to the guy at the beginning of this video. 4:30 in the morning, LinkedIn posts about sacrifice. 12,000 take-home dollars across 2 years of structured exhaustion, while a friend who went to bed early made 42,000 just by showing up and automating his savings. Here is what I think actually happened to that guy, and to the millions of people who ran faithfully on the hustle culture treadmill across the last decade and a half. The problem was never the effort. Effort is real. Effort is necessary. You are not going to build a software tool in 8 months without putting in genuine work. You are not going to accumulate any capital at all without the discipline to spend less than you earn. Effort is necessary, but effort is not sufficient. And hustle culture sold effort as if it were the complete formula, when effort is maybe the first 15% of what actually produces wealth. The other 85% is structure, timing, incentive alignment, and leverage. Without those, effort is just the treadmill, fast, sweaty, and stationary. Gen Z, having watched this experiment run to its natural conclusion in real time across their feeds and in their families and in their peer groups, is not refusing to work. They are refusing to work without architecture. They are refusing to trade effort for effort's own sake, in a structure that has been empirically demonstrated to produce exhaustion without commensurate financial position change. And I think that is not laziness. I think that is the most rational financial position any cohort has staked out in modern economic history. And the older generation's response, "They're soft, they don't want to earn it," is not a serious engagement with the argument. It's a defense mechanism from people who spent years on the treadmill and need to believe the treadmill was the right choice. 3 things. Practical, no inspiration attached. The first, separate income from wealth as cognitive categories right now, permanently. These are not synonyms. They are not even particularly close. Relatives, income is what arrives. Wealth is what stays and then grows on its own. Hustle culture is structurally obsessed with income because income is visible, measurable, postable, and produces immediate social feedback. Wealth is quiet, slow, and nearly invisible from the outside. The person making $200,000 a year in freelance income with no investable assets, no owned systems, no compounding capital, they are structurally weaker than the person making $70,000 a year with $250,000 in diversified assets earning 9% annually. The number on your paycheck is not your score. Your net worth and the rate at which your assets compound independent of your labor is your score. Until you understand that distinction at a cellular level, you will keep optimizing for the wrong variable. The second, think in machines, not muscles. Every hour you spend using direct personal labor to produce income, the question you should be asking is, could this function be replicated by a system, a product, or an asset that does not require my presence? Not always immediately, yes. Not always possible, but the question has to run constantly in the background. The strategic goal is to convert muscle-based income, time directly exchanged for money, into machine-based income, an asset or system that generates money without you attached to it, at the fastest structurally feasible pace. That conversion is the actual financial event. Not the raise, not the hustle revenue number. The moment your assets produce enough return that you could stop your direct labor and not be financially destroyed, that is the threshold. That is the thing worth building toward. The treadmill keeps you from thinking about this because the treadmill keeps you busy, which is the whole point of a treadmill. The third, be structurally suspicious of financial advice where the person giving it makes money from you following it regardless of whether it works for you. This is not cynicism. This is just applied incentive analysis. If a course creator sells you a course on building a business, they have captured revenue whether or not the course produces results for you. The incentive that governs their behavior is to sell the course, not to produce your financial outcome. Those are different incentives. Hustle culture content is, in the aggregate, produced by people who monetize the content about hustle rather than the hustle itself. The person with the 4 a.m. wake up YouTube channel with 3 million subscribers is not rich because they wake up at 4 a.m. They're rich because 3 million people watch them wake up at 4 a.m. and generate advertising revenue. And of course, sales. The product is the content about the treadmill, not the treadmill. They sold you a subscription to watch someone run in place and told you it was a travel documentary. None of this is an argument that you don't work. It's an argument that you work on things architectured for leverage, in defined phases, with the explicit goal of accumulating capital and building systems rather than maximizing hourly output for its own sake. Markets don't reward effort uniformly. Markets reward positioning, timing, and ownership. The person who owned the right asset in the right structure at the right time consistently outperforms the person who worked the hardest. That's not a cynical observation, that's just a historical record. The people who quietly figured this out, who never posted about their grind, never built a personal brand around their morning routine, never bought the course, those are the people who end up in their early 30s with real options. Not I'm building something options, not I'm in the process options. Actual financial options, the kind where the math works without them having to be present. If this channel is in your feed and you want more of this kind of analysis, subscribe. That's it.